91%. That's how many Japanese aircraft carrier crew members were dead by August 1945. Not wounded, not missing, not captured, dead. For every 100 sailors who served on Imperial Navy carriers during World War II, only 9 lived to see the end of the war. Think about that for a second. If you lined up 100 men on a carrier deck in 1941, by 1945, 91 of them would be gone, forever. Japan started the Pacific War with 10 fleet carriers. These weren't just ships, they were floating cities of steel, each one carrying thousands of men and dozens of aircraft. They were the most advanced weapons on Earth, the cutting edge of naval warfare. 6 of these carriers attacked Pearl Harbor and changed history in a single morning. By August 1945, Japan had 0 operational carriers left. 0. But here's what's even darker. It's not just that the ships were destroyed. It's that almost everyone who served on them died. We're talking about more than 25,000 sailors who went down with their vessels or burned in the Pacific. That's not a casualty rate. That's closer to extinction. Most people know Japan lost the war. What they don't know is how a single decision made in 1941 turned the most elite naval aviation force in the world into a death sentence for almost everyone who served in it. This wasn't about bravery. Japanese carrier crews were as brave as any warriors in history. This wasn't about technology either. At the start of the war, Japanese carriers were the best in the world. This was about mathematics. Cold, brutal arithmetic that Japan's leaders either couldn't see or refused to accept. I'm going to show you exactly how an entire naval culture committed what I can only call industrial suicide. How a philosophy that sounded like warrior wisdom was actually a mathematical equation for mass death. How the same decision-making that led to early victories guaranteed that almost no one would survive to celebrate them. By the end of this story, you'll understand why that 91% death rate wasn't bad luck or superior American firepower. It was baked into the system from day one. The men who died on those carriers were doomed before the first bomb ever fell. And the truly horrifying part? The people in charge knew it was happening and didn't change course until it was far too late. Let me start by showing you what made Japanese carrier crews the best in the world, because you need to understand how far they fell. December 1941. Japanese carrier pilots were untouchable. Every single aviator had logged over 800 hours of flight training. Not classroom time, actual time in the cockpit. That's more than most commercial pilots have today. These men had spent years perfecting their craft, and many of them had real combat experience fighting over China since 1937. To put this in perspective, American carrier pilots at the start of the war had maybe 300 hours of training. The Japanese had more than double that. They could land on a pitching carrier deck at night. They could hit a moving ship from a dive that would make most pilots black out. They were, without exaggeration, the finest naval aviators ever assembled. The carriers themselves were legendary. The Akagi, the Kaga, the Soryu and Hiryu, the Shokaku and Zuikaku. These names struck fear across the Pacific. Each one was a masterpiece of engineering, capable of launching devastating airstrikes that could appear out of nowhere and vanish just as fast. Pearl Harbor proved what this combination could do. 6 Japanese carriers launched 353 aircraft in 2 waves. They caught the entire American Pacific Fleet anchored and unprepared. In less than 2 hours, they sank or damaged 21 ships and killed over 2,400 Americans. It was the most successful carrier operation in naval history. But success created a dangerous illusion. The Imperial Navy had a doctrine called Keshi Hisho. It translates roughly to certain victory through decisive action. The idea was simple and seductive. Keep your best warriors in constant combat. Never pull them back. Never rotate them to safer positions. Every experienced pilot, every veteran crew member, would stay on the front lines until final victory was achieved. It was the samurai code applied to industrial warfare. Offensive spirit conquers all. Retreat is weakness. The warrior who survives battle returns immediately to fight again. The Americans did the exact opposite. After 6 months of combat, experienced pilots were rotated home. They became instructors. They passed their hard-won knowledge to the next generation of aviators. Japanese commanders looked at this American policy and saw cowardice. They saw a culture that valued individual survival over collective victory. They were catastrophically wrong. 6 months after Pearl Harbor, this philosophical difference would start killing Japanese carrier crews by the thousands. And once it started, it never stopped. June 4th, 1942. 4 Japanese fleet carriers sailing toward a tiny island called Midway. The Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. These were 4 of the 6 carriers that had attacked Pearl Harbor. They were coming to finish what they started, to draw out the remaining American carriers and destroy them. Instead, all 4 Japanese carriers were sunk in a single day. Everyone knows this was a major defeat for Japan. What most people don't know is what actually died at Midway. It wasn't just the ships. The 4 carriers represented 40% of Japan's fleet carrier strength. Losing them was devastating. But Japan had shipyards. They had steel. They could build more carriers. That would take time, but it was possible. What they couldn't replace were the men. At Midway, Japan lost 110 veteran pilots. Each one had over 2 years of training and combat experience. These weren't rookies who'd been flying for a few months. These were the elite, the men who had spent years mastering their craft and had survived real combat. Here's where the mathematics starts to destroy Japan. In 1942, Japan was producing about 200 new pilots per month. The United States was producing 2,500. That's not a misprint. For every Japanese pilot that graduated from training, America was graduating 12 and a half. Do the math. Even if Japan never lost another single pilot for the rest of the war, which is insane to even consider, they were already being buried by American production. But they were losing pilots, hundreds of them, and because of that Keshi Hisho doctrine, because they refused to rotate veterans home to train the next generation, every loss was permanent. At Midway, the veteran pilots died, teaching nothing to no one. Their knowledge died with them. But let me show you how bad it actually was on those carriers. The Kaga took 4 bombs from American dive bombers. Just 4 bombs. But watch what happened next. The first bomb penetrated to the hangar deck. That's the enclosed space below the flight deck where aircraft were stored, armed, and fueled. Japanese carriers armed and fueled their aircraft in these enclosed hangars. American carriers did it topside, on the open flight deck. This difference seems small. It wasn't. When that first bomb hit the Kaga's hangar, it didn't just destroy one aircraft, it set off a chain reaction. Aircraft packed with fuel and armed with bombs and torpedoes started exploding. One plane ignited the next, which ignited the next. 20 aircraft detonated in an enclosed steel box. The hangar deck turned into a blast furnace. The temperature got so hot that survivors reported the steel deck plates were glowing red. You could see it from other ships. 811 men died on the Kaga. Most of them burned to death in less than 10 minutes. A survivor who made it off the ship said the hangar deck sounded like continuous thunder, explosion after explosion, with no pause. The men who didn't burn immediately were trapped below decks as the ship filled with smoke and toxic fumes. They suffocated in the dark, waiting for help that never came. The other 3 carriers died the same way. Bombs in the hangar. Chain reaction explosions. Hundreds of men trapped below as their ships turned into crematoriums. By sunset on June 4th, over 3,000 Japanese sailors were dead. But here's the thing that sealed Japan's fate. After Midway, after losing 4 carriers and 110 irreplaceable veteran pilots, the Imperial Navy looked at their doctrine and changed nothing. Nothing. They still refused to rotate experienced pilots home. The veterans who survived Midway went right back into combat. And one by one, they died. Every single one of them. There was no second tour, no instructor duty. No training the next generation. The war was already over. It would just take 3 more years and thousands more deaths to prove it. By 1943, something terrifying was happening to Japanese pilot training. Remember those 800-hour flight programs that produced the elite pilots of 1,941? Gone. In 1943, new pilots were getting about 100 hours of training before being sent to carriers. That's barely enough time to learn basic flight maneuvers, let alone combat tactics or carrier landings. By 1944, it got worse. New Japanese pilots were receiving 30 to 50 hours of total flight time, and most of that wasn't even in real aircraft. They were training in gliders to save fuel. Japan was running out of aviation fuel, so they were teaching kids to fly carriers in aircraft that had no engines. Meanwhile, American pilots were still getting 300 hours of training, and 100 of those hours were in actual operational aircraft, the same planes they'd fly in combat. The gap wasn't just growing, it was becoming a chasm. Why did this happen? Because there was nobody left to teach. Every veteran Japanese pilot was either dead or still in combat. The Keshi Hisho doctrine meant that the men who knew how to fly, how to fight, how to survive, were all still on the front lines. There were no instructors, because instructors were considered a luxury Japan couldn't afford. So teenagers with barely any flight time were being sent to carriers, trying to land aircraft on moving decks in rough seas. Many of them couldn't do it even in calm weather. They'd crash on landing, sometimes destroying their own aircraft and damaging the carrier deck in the process. The ones who did make it to combat didn't last long. June 19th, 1944. The Battle of the Philippine Sea. Americans called it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, and the name tells you everything you need to know. Japan sent 3 carriers and over 400 aircraft into battle. American pilots shot them out of the sky like they were target practice. Japanese losses: 3 carriers sunk, 645 aircraft destroyed, 450 pilots killed. Only 43 pilots were rescued from the water. American losses: 123 aircraft, 76 aircrew. The kill ratio was almost 10 to 1. That's not a battle between professionals. That's experienced pilots massacring kids who barely knew how to fly. Let me put it another way. In a single day, Japan lost 450 pilots. That's more than twice their monthly production. They were losing pilots faster than they could train them, and the pilots they were training were so poorly prepared that they were basically flying to their deaths. After the war, a captured Japanese naval officer was interviewed. He said something that still gives me chills. After Midway, we knew we couldn't replace the pilots. Every carrier operation after that was a suicide mission. We just didn't call them that yet. Think about what that means. Japanese commanders knew they were sending men to die. They knew the pilots were undertrained. They knew the mathematics didn't work. And they did it anyway, because changing course would mean admitting the entire philosophy was wrong. So, the doctrine stayed the same. Keep sending pilots into combat. Keep losing them. Keep training worse replacements. Over and over until there was almost no one left. The vicious cycle was complete. Fewer veterans meant worse training. Worse training meant more deaths. More deaths meant even fewer veterans. By late 1944, Japanese carrier pilots were launching for combat, knowing they probably wouldn't come back, not because of some noble sacrifice, but because they literally didn't have the skills to survive. But even if Japan had somehow trained perfect pilots, it wouldn't have mattered, because the carriers themselves were designed to kill their own crews. Let's talk about something that military historians don't emphasize enough. Japanese carriers weren't just outfought. They were fundamentally designed to maximize casualties when hit. This wasn't an accident. It was doctrine. The Imperial Navy's entire philosophy on damage control can be summed up in one phrase: offensive spirit overcomes material weakness. What that actually meant in practice was that planning for damage was considered defeatist thinking. Real warriors didn't prepare to get hit. Real warriors focused on attacking. So, Japanese carriers didn't have proper damage control training. They didn't have firefighting schools like the Americans did. They had buckets, literal buckets of water and sand. That was the plan for fighting a gasoline fire on a ship carrying hundreds of thousands of gallons of aviation fuel. American carriers had dedicated damage control teams who trained constantly. They had firefighting equipment, chemical suppressants, redundant pumping systems. When an American carrier got hit, dozens of men immediately knew exactly what to do. They'd practiced it hundreds of times. Japanese carriers had brave men with buckets, waiting for officers to tell them what to do. Officers who often had no idea what to do because nobody had trained them either. But it gets worse. Japanese carriers had another fatal design flaw: no radar-directed anti-aircraft guns until late 1944. Their gunners were aiming manually at aircraft moving 400 miles per hour. The hit probability was about 2%. American carriers with radar fire control systems had an 18% hit probability. Think about what that means. Japanese carriers couldn't effectively defend themselves from air attack. They were sailing into battles where enemy aircraft could strike them almost at will, and their defensive guns might as well have been shooting blanks. Now, let me show you what all of these failures looked like in real life. June 19th, 1944, the same day as the Turkey shoot. The carrier Taiho was the newest, most advanced carrier in the Japanese fleet. She'd only been in service for a few months. 34,000 tons of steel, the pride of the Imperial Navy. An American submarine fired a spread of torpedoes. One of them hit the Taiho on the starboard side. Just one torpedo. The damage looked survivable. The ship was still making 26 knots. The flight deck was still operational. But then, the failures started cascading. The torpedo had ruptured some aviation fuel tanks. Fuel was leaking into the ship. The crew didn't properly seal the damaged compartments. They didn't know how. Nobody had trained them on damage control procedures, because that was considered negative thinking. Then someone made a decision that killed everyone. They didn't shut off the ventilation systems. Aviation fuel vapors started spreading through the ship's ventilation, mixing with air, creating an explosive atmosphere in enclosed spaces throughout the carrier. For 6 hours, the Taiho sailed as a floating bomb. The crew had no idea they were in danger. Officers were still running normal operations. Aircraft were still launching and landing. Then, 6 hours after the torpedo hit, a damaged generator threw a single spark. The entire ship exploded. Witnesses on other ships said the Taiho just came apart. The explosion was so massive that it blew out the sides of the hull. The hangar deck, the flight deck, everything just ripped open. The carrier broke in half and sank in minutes. Over 1,600 men died. A survivor who was rescued from the water later described what happened below decks. He said men were waiting for orders on what to do. They could smell the fuel vapors but didn't know what it meant. Nobody came to tell them to evacuate. Nobody came to tell them to seal compartments or fight the leak. He said, "We didn't know what we were supposed to do. No one had trained us for this. We just waited for orders that never came." The Taiho didn't sink because of American superiority. It sank because the Imperial Navy considered damage control training a waste of time. One torpedo, 6 hours of preventable failures, and 1,600 men dead. Compare that to the American carrier Yorktown at Midway. She took multiple bomb and torpedo hits, massive damage. But the crew knew exactly what to do. They fought fires, sealed compartments, kept the ship afloat for days. She eventually sank, but most of the crew survived because they'd been trained for this exact scenario. Japanese carriers had no such training. When they got hit, chaos. When fires started, panic. When systems failed, confusion. The ships weren't just carriers. They were steel coffins waiting for a spark. But even if Japanese carriers had perfect design, perfect damage control, perfect defenses, it wouldn't have saved them, because the industrial mathematics of the war made Japanese defeat inevitable from the start. After Midway, Japan had 6 fleet carriers left. The Americans hadn't sunk them all. Japan still had a carrier force. They still had a chance to rebuild, right? Here's what happened next. Between 1942 and 1944, Japan completed 7 new fleet carriers, 7 ships. That's a significant industrial effort. Building a carrier takes years, thousands of workers, massive amounts of steel and resources. Japan was pouring everything they had into replacing their losses. In that same period, the United States built 90 carriers. That's not a typo. 90 carriers in the same time frame. Japan built 7. In 1944 alone, America launched 19 new carriers. Japan launched 1. The numbers are so lopsided they almost don't make sense. But this was American industrial capacity in full swing. Shipyards working 24 hours a day. Assembly line production of standardized Essex-class carriers. Ships rolling out so fast that Japan couldn't sink them as quickly as America could build them. Even if Japan sank 1 American carrier every single month, which they couldn't, America would still be adding carriers to the fleet faster than they were losing them. Japan was fighting an industrial machine with warrior spirit, and spirit doesn't build ships. But here's where it gets truly dark. Japan knew they were outmatched industrially. They'd known it from before the war even started. The entire Japanese strategy was based on winning quickly, forcing a negotiated peace before American production could ramp up. That strategy died at Midway. After that, every battle was just delaying the inevitable. And yet, they kept building carriers. They kept sending crews to man them. They kept pretending the mathematics would somehow change. Let me show you just how delusional this became. November 28, 1944. The carrier Shinano left Tokyo Bay on her maiden voyage. This wasn't just any carrier. This was the largest aircraft carrier ever built, 72,000 tons. Converted from a Yamato-class battleship hull, she was supposed to be unsinkable, a symbol that Japan could still compete. The ship sailed with a green crew. Most of them had never served on a carrier before. They'd certainly never trained together as a unit. The damage control equipment was still in crates, unpacked. Nobody had been trained on how to use it because there wasn't time. The Shinano was sailing to Kure Naval Base for final fitting out. It should have been a routine trip along the Japanese coast. Instead, an American submarine, the USS Archerfish, intercepted her on the first night. 4 torpedoes hit the Shinano. 4 torpedoes shouldn't sink a 72,000-ton carrier. The ship was massive, with multiple compartments, redundant systems. The damage was survivable if the crew knew what to do. They didn't. The crew couldn't operate the watertight doors properly. Some doors weren't closed at all because nobody had trained them on the procedure. The pumps sat unused because the crew didn't know how to start them. Damage control equipment remained in unopened crates while water flooded through the ship. Officers gave contradictory orders. Some compartments were sealed with men still inside. Other compartments that should have been sealed were left open. 10 hours after the torpedo hits, the largest carrier ever built rolled over and sank. 1,435 men died. That's more than died on the battleship Arizona at Pearl Harbor. The Shinano never launched a single aircraft in combat, never fought a single battle. The pride of the Japanese Navy was killed by 4 torpedoes and a crew that didn't know how to save their own ship. After the war, American naval engineers studied the sinking. Their conclusion: with proper damage control, the Shinano should have survived. The torpedo damage wasn't fatal. The incompetence was. This is what the industrial gap had created. Japan was building ships they couldn't crew properly. They were launching carriers with sailors who had no training. They were fighting a war they'd already lost, throwing men into steel coffins and calling it strategy. By 1945, Japan's carrier fleet existed only as numbers on paper. Ships that couldn't fight, crews that couldn't survive, pilots who didn't exist. The endgame was coming. and it would be even darker than what came before. By 1945, Japanese carriers had one purpose left. They weren't weapons anymore. They were one-way launch platforms for kamikaze attacks. The pilots flying off these carriers had so little training they couldn't land back on the deck. This wasn't philosophy. This wasn't honorable sacrifice. They literally didn't have the skills to perform a carrier landing. The missions were one way by necessity, not just by design. The carrier crews knew their job: sail within launching range of American ships, send the aircraft off, wait to be sunk. Survival wasn't part of the mission parameters. The carrier Amagi spent the final months of the war hidden in a bay near Kure, covered with camouflage netting. The crew stayed aboard, maintaining a ship that would never sail again. They were waiting for pilots who would never come, for aircraft that didn't exist, for a war that was already over. On July 24, 1945, American carrier aircraft found the Amagi and destroyed her at anchor. The crew was still aboard when the bombs fell. They died on a stationary ship that hadn't moved in months. Other carriers met similar ends, sunk at their moorings, scuttled by their own crews, captured by Americans and scrapped. Most of them never fought their final battle. They just waited to die. 91%. Now you know why. Japan started the war with 3,500 trained carrier aviators, the best naval pilots in the world, men with 800 hours of flight training and years of combat experience. By August 1945, 112 of them were still alive. Over 25,000 Japanese sailors died serving on carriers during the war, not because they were cowards, not because they lacked fighting spirit. Every single one of them showed extraordinary courage. They died because their leaders made a decision in 1941 that was mathematically unsustainable. Never rotate experienced pilots home. Keep every veteran in constant combat until final victory or death. It was called Keshi Hisho, certain victory through decisive action. It became certain death through systematic attrition. 3 failures combined to create that 91% death rate. First, the refusal to rotate experienced personnel meant every loss was permanent. Knowledge died with the men instead of being passed on. Second, carriers designed as death traps with no proper damage control training meant survivable damage became catastrophic. Third, fighting American industrial capacity with warrior philosophy meant Japan was always going to run out of everything except courage. They didn't lose because they were weak. They lost because they consumed their most valuable resource, experienced people, faster than they could replace them. They turned carriers into steel coffins and kept sending men to crew them long after everyone knew the mathematics made victory impossible. A generation of sailors trusted their leaders to give them a fighting chance. What they got was mathematical inevitability wrapped in warrior philosophy. The tragedy isn't that Japan lost the war. The tragedy is that by the time anyone in command realized the arithmetic didn't work, everyone who could have changed it was already dead. The carriers didn't just sink. They took 91% of their men with them, victims not of American superiority, but of a system that valued offensive spirit over mathematical reality. By August 1945, the sea had claimed almost all of them, and the few who survived carried the weight of everyone who didn't.